Saturday night, July 14, 1945. Deep in the heart of Texas, beneath a sky scattered with stars that seemed close enough to touch, something impossible was happening at Camp Swift. Inside a converted mess hall decorated with strings of lights and handmade paper lanterns, American cowboys were asking German prisoners of war to dance. The wooden floor creaked beneath boots and worn shoes as a local band played a tentative rendition of "You Are My Sunshine." 23-year-old Liesl Fisher stood against the wall, her hands trembling as she watched fellow prisoners accept invitations from young men in cowboy hats and rolled-up sleeves. These were the same guards who had watched over them for months, maintained the barbed wire that surrounded their compound, and ensured they followed camp regulations. Now they were smiling, offering their hands, treating the German women not as enemies, but as guests at a community social. Liesl's mind struggled to reconcile this moment with everything she had expected when she was captured 7 months earlier in France. She had prepared herself for cruelty, for punishment, for the treatment she had been told Americans reserved for their prisoners. Instead, she had found something that defied all her training, all her propaganda-fed expectations. She had found kindness. And now this, a dance. An invitation to step across an invisible line that separated captor from captive, enemy from friend, past from possible future. A young ranch hand named Tommy Patterson approached her with an awkward but genuine smile. His sun-weathered face showed the same nervousness she felt. He extended his hand and spoke in slow, careful English that he knew she could understand. "Ma'am, would you care to dance?" "Nothing fancy, just a simple two-step." Liesl looked at his calloused hand, extended in invitation rather than command. In that moment, she understood that accepting or refusing wasn't just about a dance. It was about choosing what kind of person she would become in the aftermath of war. It was about deciding whether the barriers of nationality, ideology, and conflict could be crossed by individual acts of courage and grace. Before we discover what led to this extraordinary moment and what Liesl chose, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story of how German women prisoners found themselves in the middle of Texas, expected punishment, but discovered something that would change their lives forever, begins 7 months earlier in the bitter cold of December 1944, when the first transport arrived at a camp that would challenge everything these women thought they knew about their enemies and themselves. The story begins 7 months earlier, on a cold December morning in 1944, when 3 military trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Swift, Texas, carrying 38 German women prisoners. They had been transported from the East Coast after their capture during the Allied advance through France and Belgium. Most had served as communications specialists, medical personnel, and administrative staff for the Wehrmacht. Now they found themselves in a landscape so foreign it might as well have been another planet. The flat expanses of central Texas stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by scattered oak trees and distant horizons that made the women feel exposed and vulnerable after the enclosed valleys and forests of Europe. 23-year-old Liesl Fisher pressed her face against the canvas covering of the truck, catching glimpses of this strange new world. She had grown up in Stuttgart, where buildings crowded together and mountains rose in the distance. Here, the sky dominated everything, vast and overwhelming in its openness. Next to her sat 19-year-old Margarete Schulz, who had been a radio operator before her capture. Margarete's hands still bore the calluses from months of operating field equipment. Now those same hands gripped a small photograph of her family, the only possession she had managed to keep through the chaos of capture and transport. The truck stopped in front of a series of plain wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fencing. Guard towers marked each corner of the compound. The women had expected this. What they hadn't expected was the way the American guards helped them down from the trucks with unexpected gentleness, or how the camp commander, Colonel William Harrison, addressed them in halting but respectful German. He was a tall man with graying hair and eyes that showed more weariness than hostility. He explained the camp rules clearly and without threat, emphasizing that they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, and with the dignity their status as prisoners of war required. Liesel noticed something else that surprised her. The other prisoners at Camp Swift, all men held in a separate compound, were working in nearby fields alongside American soldiers. There was no visible brutality, no signs of the harsh treatment she had been conditioned to expect. The German men looked healthy, adequately fed, and they worked at a steady pace rather than the desperate exhaustion of slave labor. One of the guards, a young corporal named Jack Martinez, whose family had immigrated from Mexico 2 generations earlier, showed the women to their barracks. His manner was professional, but not unkind. He explained in simple English, supplemented with gestures, where they would sleep, where meals would be served, and what their daily routine would involve. Inside the barracks, the women found simple but clean accommodations. Each had a cot with blankets, a small trunk for personal belongings, and access to washing facilities that, while basic, were functional and maintained. Winter settled over central Texas with a different character than the harsh European winters the German women had known. The cold came in sudden sweeps rather than sustained freezes, and the landscape remained brown and sparse rather than blanketed in snow. Liesel found the weather disorienting, never quite knowing how to dress for days that could start frigid and end warm by afternoon. It was during one of these unpredictable cold snaps in early January 1945 that she experienced the first gesture that would begin to reshape her understanding of her captors. She had been assigned to work in the camp laundry, a steaming building where massive washing machines processed uniforms and linens for the entire facility. The work was hard but not unbearable, and Liesel appreciated having something to occupy her hands and mind. On a particularly cold morning, she made the walk from her barracks to the laundry building without adequate clothing, having misjudged the temperature. Her thin auxiliary uniform jacket provided little protection against the biting wind that swept across the open compound. She arrived at the laundry, shivering, her fingers numb and her teeth chattering. Corporal Martinez noticed immediately. Without saying a word, he disappeared and returned 10 minutes later with a heavy wool cardigan. It was clearly his own personal clothing, worn at the elbows and smelling faintly of tobacco and leather. He held it out to her with a simple gesture that needed no translation. Liesel hesitated, confused by this unexpected kindness. In her training, she had been taught that accepting favors from the enemy was a sign of weakness, a betrayal of her duty as a soldier. But she was also freezing, and the genuine concern in the young corporal's eyes seemed to transcend the boundaries of nation and conflict. She accepted the cardigan with a quiet "Danke," then quickly corrected herself. "Thank you." Corporal Martinez smiled and nodded, pleased that she had attempted English. It was a small moment, barely worth noting in the grand scheme of war and captivity. But for Liesel, it planted a seed of doubt about everything she had been told about American cruelty and heartlessness. The cardigan became something more than just warmth. It became evidence that the enemy might be more complex than the simple monsters of propaganda. Word of such gestures spread through the women's compound like ripples on water. Marguerite Schultz received help with her English from Guard Sergeant Robert Hayes, a patient teacher who used drawings and pantomime to bridge the language gap. Another prisoner, 31-year-old Anna Kraus, found that the camp doctor treated her recurring headaches with genuine medical concern rather than dismissive indifference. Spring arrived in Texas with an explosion of wildflowers that transformed the landscape into a carpet of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush. For the German women, who had spent months in the muted browns and grays of winter, the sudden burst of color felt like a promise that beauty could still exist in a world torn apart by war. Liesel found herself assigned to help plant a vegetable garden that would supplement the camp's food supplies. It was there, kneeling in the rich Texas soil, that she began to remember what it felt like to laugh. The garden project had been organized by the camp's senior administrator, a practical woman named Mrs. Dorothy Chen, who believed that growing things was good for morale. She paired German prisoners with American guards and civilian workers, creating teams that had no choice but to communicate and cooperate. Liesel found herself working alongside Tommy Patterson, the young ranch hand whose family owned land adjacent to the camp. He was 20 years old, with sun-bleached hair and a slow, easy way of speaking that Liesel found both frustrating and oddly comforting. Tommy took his role as garden instructor seriously, demonstrating how to plant tomato seedlings and stake them properly for the Texas heat that would soon arrive. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had worked soil his entire life. When Liesel struggled to understand his instructions, he would slow down, use simpler words, and show her again with patient good humor. He treated her not as a prisoner or an enemy, but as someone learning a new skill who deserved respect and encouragement. One afternoon, as they worked side by side planting rows of beans, Tommy began to hum a tune. It was a simple melody, something cheerful and mindless. Liesel recognized it as one of the songs the camp radio played during evening hours. Without thinking, she found herself humming along. Tommy looked up, surprised and pleased. "You know this one?" he asked. Liesel nodded, then attempted the English words she had picked up from hearing it repeatedly. Her pronunciation was terrible, mangling the lyrics into something almost unrecognizable. Tommy tried to keep a straight face, but failed. His laughter started as a chuckle and grew into a full, genuine laugh. For a moment, Liesel felt embarrassed. Then she saw that he wasn't laughing at her cruelly, but with the kind of amusement that invited her to join in rather than feel mocked. And suddenly, miraculously, she was laughing too. It was the first time since her capture that she had laughed freely, without bitterness or irony. The sound felt strange in her throat, rusty from disuse. April 1945 brought news that would shatter the fragile peace the German women had begun to build within themselves. Reports from Europe began filtering into the camp through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and official military briefings. Allied forces advancing through Germany were discovering concentration camps, places with names that would become synonymous with humanity's darkest capabilities. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The descriptions that accompanied these names were so horrific that many of the German women initially refused to believe them, convinced they were enemy propaganda designed to demoralize and shame. Liesel sat in the camp's small recreation room, surrounded by other German prisoners, as they pored over copies of American newspapers that had been made available to them. The images were grainy but clear enough to convey unspeakable horror. Emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors who looked more like walking skeletons than human beings. Testimony from liberators who struggled to find words adequate to describe what they had witnessed. The accompanying articles described systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension, industrial processes designed for the efficient destruction of human life. Margarete Schultz sat beside Liesel, her hands shaking as she read. Her English had improved enough to understand the articles without needing translation. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered in German, "This cannot be real. Our country could not have done this. We would have known." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her voice. How many things had they been told were enemy lies that had turned out to be true? How many times had their government assured them of victories that were actually defeats? If they had been lied to about so much else, why not about this? Anna Kraus, the oldest of their group at 31, had always been the most stalwart defender of their homeland's honor. She had maintained throughout their captivity that Germany had been fighting a defensive war, protecting itself against enemies who sought its destruction. Now she sat in silence, staring at a photograph of children behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow and accusing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I have a daughter. She is 8 years old. These children in the photographs, they are someone's daughters and sons too." The realization hit the women in waves, each new revelation more devastating than the last. They had not been serving their country's defense. They had been part of a regime that committed atrocities beyond imagination. June 1945 arrived with the oppressive heat that defined Texas summers. The war in Europe had ended, and victory celebrations had swept across America. But for the German women at Camp Swift, the end of the war brought not relief, but deeper uncertainty. They existed in a strange limbo, no longer fighting but not yet free, burdened with knowledge about their homeland that made the thought of return almost unbearable. It was during this time of collective despair that an unexpected invitation arrived that would plant seeds of hope in soil made fertile by months of gradual transformation. Colonel Harrison called a meeting of all the German women prisoners on a sweltering afternoon in early June. They gathered in the mess hall, fanning themselves against the heat and wondering what new regulation or restriction was about to be announced. Instead, the colonel brought news that left them stunned into silence. Several local ranching families had approached him with a proposal. They wanted to invite the German prisoners to attend a community celebration being held to honor local servicemen returning from the war. The families understood the unusual nature of their request, but they had heard about the women's conduct during their months at Camp Swift and believed that extending hospitality might serve as a small gesture toward healing the wounds of war. Liesel felt her heart racing as Colonel Harrison explained the details. The celebration would be held at the Patterson Ranch, the same family where Tommy worked. It would include a meal, music, and dancing. The women would be accompanied by guards, of course, but they would be treated as guests rather than prisoners. Attendance was voluntary. No one would be forced to participate if they felt uncomfortable with the situation. The room erupted in whispered German conversations as the women processed this information. Some were immediately suspicious, wondering if this was some kind of test or trick. Others felt it was inappropriate to celebrate with Americans when their own country lay in ruins. But many, including Liesel, felt something else stirring inside them. Hope. The possibility that they might be more than their past, more than their nationality, more than the uniform they had once worn. Margarete leaned close to Liesel and whispered, "Are you going to accept?" Liesel thought about Tommy's patient kindness in the garden, about Corporal Martinez's sweater on that cold morning, about the countless small gestures that had accumulated over months like drops of water, slowly filling an empty vessel. August 1945 brought official repatriation orders from Washington. The war had been over for 3 months, and the machinery of demobilization was finally processing the thousands of prisoners of war held on American soil. For the German women at Camp Swift, the announcement came on a morning that felt like any other. They had been working in the gardens, helping with laundry, attending English classes that had become less about camp necessity and more about genuine interest in learning. The community celebration in June had been a turning point for many of them. They had danced with cowboys, eaten barbecue under the Texas stars, and experienced firsthand what it meant to be welcomed rather than merely tolerated. Colonel Harrison gathered the women in the mess hall once again. His expression was serious, but not unkind, as he explained that arrangements were being made for their return to Germany. Ships would be departing from East Coast ports within 6 weeks. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to make their way home. The colonel paused after delivering this information, as if he wanted to say more but was unsure how to proceed. Finally, he added something unexpected. If any of them had concerns about their repatriation or wished to discuss their individual situations, his office would be available for private consultations. That evening, Liesel lay on her cot staring at the ceiling while conversations swirled around her in German. Some women expressed relief at the prospect of finally going home, despite their fears about what they would find there. Others spoke anxiously about families they had lost contact with, cities that no longer existed, and a country that had been divided among occupying powers. But Liesel found herself thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about the garden where she had learned to laugh again. She was thinking about the English words that now came more easily to her lips than she had ever imagined possible. She was thinking about Tommy Patterson, explaining that his family believed in second chances because his own grandfather had come to Texas with nothing and built a life through hard work and the kindness of neighbors who gave him opportunities. The next morning, Liesel requested a meeting with Colonel Harrison. Her hands shook as she entered his office, but her voice was steady when she spoke in careful English. "Colonel, I wish to discuss my repatriation. I have been thinking very much, and I must ask a question that may sound strange." She paused, gathering courage for what she was about to say. Colonel Harrison listened to Liesel's request with an expression that revealed he had been expecting something like this. She was not the first prisoner to ask about the possibility of remaining in the United States rather than accepting immediate repatriation. In fact, over the past week, 11 other women had made similar inquiries, each with their own reasons, but all sharing a common thread. They had found something in Texas that felt more like home than the devastated country they had left behind. The colonel explained that the situation was complex, but not impossible. They would need sponsors, American families, or organizations willing to vouch for them and provide housing and employment opportunities. They would need to be reclassified from prisoners of war to displaced persons seeking asylum. Most importantly, they would need to demonstrate that they posed no security threat and had genuinely rejected the ideology they once served. The process began slowly but gained momentum as word spread through the local community. Tommy Patterson's family was the first to step forward, offering to sponsor Liesel. His mother, Helen Patterson, a pragmatic woman who had raised 5 children on a working ranch, told Colonel Harrison that she had met Liesel at the June celebration and been impressed by her character and work ethic. "That girl has been through something that changed her," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "I believe in giving people a chance to prove who they really are, not punishing them forever for who they used to be." Other families followed. The Martinez family offered to sponsor Margarete Schultz, who had formed a close friendship with Corporal Martinez's younger sister during the English classes. Dr. William Hayes, the camp physician who had treated Anna Krause's headaches, arranged for her to work as a medical assistant at the local hospital in Bastrop, promising to supervise her training personally. Within 3 weeks, sponsors had been found for 9 of the 11 women who wished to stay. The remaining 2, after agonizing deliberation, decided that the uncertainty was too great and chose repatriation instead. The transition from prisoner to immigrant was jarring and filled with challenges neither the women nor their sponsors had fully anticipated. Liesel moved to the Patterson Ranch in late September 1945, trading the structured routine of camp life for the demanding rhythm of a working cattle operation. She woke before dawn to help with breakfast, spent her days learning everything from fence repair to bookkeeping, and fell into bed each night exhausted but strangely satisfied. The work was harder than anything she had done in the camp, but it was work that built something rather than merely passing time. The years between 1946 and 1950 saw the German women who had chosen to remain in Texas gradually transform from displaced persons into members of their adopted communities. But their transformation was not a simple erasure of their past or a severing of ties to their homeland. Instead, they became living bridges between 2 worlds, maintaining correspondence with those who had returned to Germany while building new lives in the American Southwest. The letters that crossed the Atlantic during those years told parallel stories of struggle, resilience, and the painful process of rebuilding identity from fragments of shattered certainty. Liesel became an American citizen in 1948, standing in a courthouse in Austin with her hand on a Bible, reciting the oath of allegiance in English that now came naturally to her tongue. Helen Patterson stood beside her as a witness, tears streaming down her weathered face. The older woman had become more than a sponsor to Liesel. She had become a second mother, teaching her not just how to survive in Texas, but how to belong. Liesel had proven herself invaluable on the ranch, her meticulous German organizational skills transforming the family's chaotic record-keeping into a system that actually functioned. But more importantly, she had become part of the family's fabric, joining them for Sunday dinners, helping to care for Helen's aging father, and sharing in both their joys and sorrows. Margarete Schultz found her calling in education. With support from the Martinez family, she attended Teachers College and by 1949 was teaching German language and European history at Bastrop High School. Her classroom became a place where she could honestly confront the complexity of her homeland's history, neither defending the indefensible nor reducing an entire culture to its darkest chapter. Her students learned German from someone who carried the language in her bones, but also carried the weight of understanding what happened when nationalism twisted into hatred. She received letters from her cousin in Hamburg, who described the slow reconstruction of their bombed-out city and the emergence of a new Germany that was trying to reckon honestly with its past. Anna Kraus completed her medical training and became a registered nurse at Bastrop General Hospital. She specialized in working with trauma patients, bringing to her care a depth of empathy born from her own psychological wounds. She never married, dedicating herself instead to healing others as a form of ongoing penance. 25 years after that July night when Tommy Patterson first extended his hand in invitation, Liesl Fisher Patterson stood before a gathering at the Texas State Capitol in Austin. She had been invited to speak at a ceremony honoring citizens who had contributed to German-American reconciliation and cultural understanding. Now a mother of 3, with silver threading through her dark hair and the sun-weathered complexion of someone who had spent decades working under the Texas sky, she carried with her a small leather notebook. It was the same diary she had kept during her months as a prisoner at Camp Swift, filled with entries that chronicled her transformation from enemy captive to American citizen. Her speech that day would be remembered by those present as one of the most moving testimonies about the power of individual choice to overcome historical hatred. She spoke about that night in July 1945 when Tommy had asked her to dance, and how accepting his hand had meant accepting the possibility that she could become someone different than who she had been. "I was terrified," she told the audience, her English now perfect but still carrying the faint melody of her German origins. "Not of dancing, but of what it would mean to step across that line. To admit that my enemies had shown me more humanity than my own government. To choose hope over certainty, even when that certainty was despair." She explained how the choice to stay in Texas had not been an escape from consequences, but an acceptance of responsibility. By remaining, she and the other women had committed themselves to living lives that honored the second chance they had been given. They became teachers, nurses, ranchers, and mothers. They raised children who knew both their German heritage and their American identity, teaching them that belonging to multiple worlds was not a burden but a gift. Margarete, who sat in the audience with her own family, had returned to Germany 3 times since 1950, each visit revealing a homeland that had undergone its own painful transformation. Anna had dedicated 40 years to nursing, touching thousands of lives with care, informed by her understanding of suffering and redemption. The story of the German women who chose Texas over Germany had become more than personal history. It had influenced how returning soldiers viewed their former enemies, shaped local policies toward refugees and immigrants, and demonstrated that America's greatest strength lay not in military victory, but in its capacity to transform enemies into neighbors. As Liesl concluded her speech, she held up her worn diary. "In these pages, I wrote the question every person must answer. Who will I choose to become? Texas gave me the freedom to discover that I could choose a different answer than the one I had been given. That choice, made on a dance floor 25 years ago, became the foundation of everything I am today."